We're going to read from the Bible now, and we're going to be reading from John's Gospel. This is us finishing the I Am series, and we're going to be reading from John chapter 15, verses 1 to 8. Can I encourage you, if you've got a mobile phone and you've got an app on the mobile phone, to turn to that? We're reading from the NRSV version, and this is the word of the Lord, right? So this word is the thing that God is going to change our lives with, okay? So as Sheila reads this to us, let's just try and absorb what he's saying to us. And God will want to speak to us. So the word of the Lord is absolutely fabulous. Okay, Sheila, thank you.
Yes, it's John chapter 15, verses 1 to 8, Jesus the true vine. I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. He removes every branch in me that bears no fruit. Every branch that bears fruit, he prunes to make it bear more fruit. You have already been cleansed by the word that I have spoken to you. Abide in me as I abide in you. Just as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who abide in me and I in them bear much fruit, because apart from me you can do nothing. Whoever does not abide in me is thrown away like a branch and withers. Such branches are gathered, thrown into the fire and burned. If you abide in me and my words abide in you, ask for whatever you wish and it will be done for you. My Father is glorified by this, that you bear much fruit and become my disciples. This is the word of the Lord.
That noise was hopeful, wasn't it? Yeah, can you hear me? No? Nothing? Yes, amazing. Okay, morning. I think most of you know me by now, but if you don't, my name's Dave, I'm the youth worker here, and straight after this talk I'm going to rush out to my young people because one of my leaders needs to leave very quickly. So, Dan, you're looking like you can't hear me. I just raise my... Shout. Okay. Okay, I will speak very loudly. Okay, so we're talking about Jesus saying, I am the true vine this morning. And being me, one of the first things I did when I read this was to sort of start researching all the trees in the Bible. Obviously. So trees, vines, bushes, you name it, right? And they're all around us, aren't we? Particularly where we live in Marple. Like we're so blessed to be in this place. Like I remember going to London and thinking, this is crazy. There are no trees. Like, okay, sorry. There are a few trees planted purely for human decoration every so often. It was very strange. But I'm sure most of us have trees near where we live, probably in our gardens. Even in the form of maybe hedges, loads of little trees together, or vines. We've got a kiwi vine that grows at a rapid rate. We prune it every year, and by June it's all over the pergola, and it's amazing. And so I started looking at trees in the Bible. And I was surprised to find, and you may be surprised as well, that after humans and God, the living thing mentioned the most in the Bible is trees. More than any animals. More than all the animals put together, trees. I was surprised by that. And actually, on average, trees appear once every 2 pages in the Bible. If you open your Bible up and you have 2 pages in front of you, the odds are that there'll be a tree somewhere. Now, some of them are clustered together, and some of them, but generally speaking, trees are all over the show. So what I thought we'd do this morning is go through the whole Bible, and we'll look at every tree in the Bible, and we'll go from beginning to end. And Daniel, I think you've just nicked the Bible from up here, haven't you?
Yeah.
Can I grab that back? I mean, you know it off by heart anyway, right?
Yeah, of course, yeah. And the trees. Yeah.
That's how you get through vicar school. You just recite the whole Bible and they give you a collar. Is that not? No, okay. Okay, so let's turn to Genesis 1 because I'm not playing games. And then we'll get to Jesus is saying he's the true vine sometime around 8 o'clock tonight. Don't worry, I am joking. Okay, so Genesis 1 starts with God creating the world. And we all know this story, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Like, if you've been to primary school, you've heard this. And God starts to create stuff. God says, let there be light, and God separates waters, and God makes dry land appear. The first living thing God creates is trees. That's the first thing God creates that is living, and it has seed, and it has to be fruitful and to multiply and to make more trees, to progress the creation. And then it goes on, and eventually the last living thing God makes are human beings. And God says to human beings, you have seed, and be fruitful, and multiply, and make more human beings. And there's some kind of relationship between human beings and trees right from the very get-go. Some kind of symbiotic relationship, perhaps. And this works symbolically all the way through the Bible, but it works in real life as well, right? Like, we know that we breathe in oxygen and we breathe out carbon dioxide, and trees take in carbon dioxide and they release oxygen. And we wouldn't survive without trees. And how we treat trees says an awful lot about who we are as a species. I mean, Daniel was talking about, like, we want to save the planet by printing fewer focuses. Oh, man, I've just really irritated myself. And how we treat trees says a lot about who we are. And this is true all the way through the Bible. Trees come up at a moment of decision again and again and again. It's amazing how often you find where someone is deliberating whether to act selfishly for their own gratification or whether they're choosing to act for the sake of others in the world. It's amazing how often you find a reference to a tree in that passage. I don't fully know why that is, but I think it works really well as a symbol. So don't worry, I won't go through the whole Bible. But the first detailed story in the Bible is the story of the Garden of Eden. And people who've heard me talk before will be very relieved to know that I'm talking about the Garden of Eden. It's been a while since I mentioned it. And the very last story in the Bible, the very last 2 pages in the book of Revelation, are also a story about a garden. But this is a garden in a city now. And it's very similar. So at the beginning, you have 2 people who we know as Adam and Eve eating from the tree of life in the garden by a river, and God blesses them, and God is with them. And in the very last pages of the Bible, you have people eating from the tree of life by a river, and the presence of God is with them. It's slightly different because it's gone from a garden to a city, but that's what happens when a garden grows big enough. It becomes a city, but this is a good city. This isn't London. This is a city still with actual vegetation and and wildlife and stuff. And it's beautiful. So what's all this bit in the middle, right? How do we get from here to here? Because this just seems very smooth, and this seems like it's not going to be very smooth at all. And I think what Jesus is saying about him being the true vine is a real key to understanding what has gone on, what the roller coaster is to get from here to here. So I'm just going to pull out a few details from the Garden of Eden story because I think it's helpful, and then we'll talk about Jesus. So when God creates people, The actual order in which God does this is different in Genesis 2 to Genesis 1. In Genesis 1, it's the trees and then people. In Genesis 2, it's people and then trees. Because the emphasis and the message the author is getting across is slightly different. So God creates a living being, a person, and then the first thing God does is to plant an orchard around them and says, you are to care for these trees. You are to tend them. You are to be a gardener. And there are two trees in particular in this garden. The first is called the tree of life that we've just mentioned. And the fruit is good. And you take and you eat from it, and you receive it as a good gift from God. And it's in the very center of the garden. And the idea is that this is representative of the gift of God. And you look at the tree of life, and you look beyond it. It acts almost like a window to see the God beyond it. And you receive something of heaven, something of glory, something of the wonder of creation through taking this fruit. That's the idea in the story. And the other story is the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And you take from that tree when you want something for yourself. You don't really look at that tree and see God, because you're taking from that tree for knowledge, for power, for wealth, for something selfish, essentially. And this is the difference between the two trees. The one brings life and the other ultimately brings death, because you're not looking at the source of life. Does that kind of make sense? It's very, very watered down in some sense, but it makes some sense, I think. And it's the way you take the fruit that's key. You receive fruit from the tree of life as a good gift, and you grab fruit from the tree of knowledge for yourself. You essentially treat the tree of knowledge as an idol. And by idol, I mean something that you project your desires onto to fulfill something for yourself. This is what happens a lot in the ancient world. They create statues or whatever it might be because they want a good harvest or they want fertility or something like this. The problem is that when you worship an idol, you become like it. It affects your soul in some way. Because human beings are meant to worship, and whatever they worship changes them. And so when you worship something false, and ultimately when you're worshipping yourself, it's not a window onto God anymore, it's a mirror on yourself. You're essentially worshipping yourself. It changes who you are. There are Psalms that talk about this. So we're jumping to the middle of the Bible already. That's encouraging, isn't it? So Psalm 135 talks about idols that people make, and the psalmist in this amazing song says, you make these things out of gold or silver or out of wood, like a tree, right? And it has a mouth, but it doesn't speak. And it has a nose, and it doesn't smell. And it has ears, but it doesn't hear. All who make them become like them. All who make idols become like them. They become less than human. When really you should be worshipping God through the tree of life. How does this look in modern life? How does this look to us? Because this sounds mythological and it sounds a bit, is this relevant? It is relevant, because people still worship things other than God today. And there was an amazing speech given by an author called David Foster Wallace. And he gave this speech at a university graduation about 20 years ago. And he wasn't a Christian or anything, but he gave what I think might be the greatest short sermon in the history of speaking. Right, and so he says this to this group of students about to graduate university. He says, you get to consciously decide what has meaning and what doesn't. You get to decide what to worship. Because here's something else that's weird but true. In the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is actually no such thing as atheism. There's no such thing as not worshipping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. And the compelling reason for maybe choosing some sort of God or spiritual type thing to worship is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money and things, if they are where you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough. Never feel you have enough. It's the truth. Worship your body and beauty and sexual allure, and you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die a million deaths before they finally plant you. Worship power. You will end up feeling weak and afraid, and you will need ever more power over others to numb you to your own fear. We see that all the time, don't we? Worship your intellect, being seen as smart. You will end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out. But the insidious things about these forms of worship is that they're unconscious. They're default settings. They're the kind of worship you just gradually slip into day after day, getting more and more selective about what you see and how you measure value, without ever being fully aware that that's what you're doing. And the so-called real world will not discourage you from operating on your default settings, because the so-called real world of men and money and power hums merrily along in a pool of fear and anger and frustration and craving and worship of self. Isn't that an astonishing thing to say in a speech to a group of students graduating? This is what he thought they needed to know about the world. And so we have this same choice day after day, because the story of Adam and Eve is not just a story, however you read it in the Bible, it's not a story of the first human beings, or a story that's mythological, or a story that's just a fable or something. This is our story. This is all of us. And we face those two same trees day after day after day. And I don't know about you, but I always find myself grabbing from the tree that gets me what I want. And what happens to Adam and Eve is that they are excluded from the garden, and they're no longer able to eat from the tree of life. And it seems hopeless. And it's into this situation that we find Jesus stepping. And saying things like, I am the bread of life. We've had that earlier in this series. If you eat from me, you'll have life. Well, that should ring some bells, right? He says, I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. And now today he says, I am the true vine, the tree, and I bear good fruit. And he says, my Father, God, is the vine grower. It's not about the fruit. It's about looking beyond it to the one who has made it. There is an acknowledgement that it's something beyond yourself. That's a clue that it might be to do with the tree of life rather than the other tree. Shortly after this, Jesus is sharing a meal with his friends, his disciples, and he offers them bread and wine, the bread of life, and the wine which is the fruit of the vine. And he says, this is my blood, this is life to you. And if you drink it, you will have life everlasting. Again, it's familiar. Actually, the Eastern Orthodox Church run with this image when they take the communion. And they actually say in their liturgy that when you eat the bread and drink the wine, the fruit of the vine, that you are drinking and eating the fruit of the tree of life. They see something in this. But something happens, because people can't stop grabbing from the other tree. And there are people in that world of Jesus who worship power and money and status and all that sort of thing, and they arrest Jesus and they sentence him to die. And John describes it beautifully in his gospel. He says that when they execute Jesus, it's at the place of the skull, the place of death. And they pin Jesus to a tree. They nail him to a cross, which is a tree that's been cut down and misused. People are using trees for bad purposes here, right, guys? And the tree, the cross, it says, is in the middle of two others. It's in the center. And John says that in the place where Jesus is crucified, there's a garden. He's the only gospel writer to add that detail. Jesus is crucified. The true tree of life is nailed to a tree in the center of a garden. And we see Jesus on that cross, and we can choose, right? We can choose whether we grab what we want from that and treat it as one tree, or whether we see it for what it truly is, the good gift of God. That's something else that we can do in that moment. And Jesus does die, and actually, interestingly, he's also offered a drink when he's on the cross. He's offered a drink of sour wine, fruit of the vine gone bad. Right? This is what people have done. And we do it again and again and again. And it's tragic. But there's good news because Jesus isn't just a tree of life. And he's not just God come to save us from our sin. And our sin being, by the way, grabbing selfishly from the tree. Because Jesus isn't just those two things, he's also a human being. And he's the only human being who doesn't grab from that tree. And he has accepted graciously the gift of God, and he has offered it also graciously to others. And so his overwhelming life overcomes death. And he falls, as he says earlier in John's Gospel, like a seed to the ground. And when a seed looks dead, that's when it grows. And the tree of life rises again. And we have access to this if we want it. And this is where we get to those last 2 pages of the Bible. We're skipping whole chunks, folks. This is good. But those last 2 pages of the Bible describe... I'm not going to turn to it. I have turned to it. Those last 2 pages of the Bible describe a city where the tree of life grows next to a river. And it says the fruit is there all year round, and it's good to eat. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. This city is a description of us. It's a description of the church. The city is described as the bride of Christ, which we are also described as. It's described as built on the foundation of Jesus' disciples. It's the church. And it says that we have access to the tree of life, but it's not just for us. This city has gates that are never shut. And people can come, and the leaves are for the healing of the nations. What do we offer to people? Like Daniel went round earlier and asked, what are we offering? And what have people offered to you? What is the good fruit that we offer out? How do we offer the fruit of the tree of life to the world? How do we share the presence of God with them? How do we draw them in? Which is very exciting, but I think it even gets even better than that. Because in our passage this morning, I am the true vine. Jesus doesn't say, I am the true vine, take the fruit from me and eat. He says, I'm the true vine, and you are the branches. Why? Because it's the flip side of idol worship. You become like what you worship. So if you worship Jesus, you become like Jesus. And it's not just that you have access to Jesus, you've become like him, and you are a tree of life to other people, and you offer good fruit to other people. Isn't that an extraordinary image? What does that look like for us? How do we offer that fruit out? I'm just going to close now, and David, would you mind coming back and maybe just starting to play? Because I think we need to reflect a little bit on this, just for the last 10 minutes or so. I'm just going to read one more bit of the Bible to you, just 2 verses from the book of Proverbs. This is kind of from the very center of the Bible. I just want us to reflect on what this idea looks like for us. Firstly, how do we treat Jesus? How do we grab from him what we want, or do we take the good gift and do we offer it to other people? And secondly, what does it look like for us to be the tree of life to the world? That's just a cool idea, isn't it? These two verses from Proverbs chapter 11. Those who trust in their riches will wither, but the righteous will flourish like green leaves. The fruit of the righteous is a tree of life. And so God, as we worship, would you help us to acknowledge that truth within ourselves? And would you help us to, in those moments when we worship other things, to remember that you are the source of life, and to turn our eyes back upon you. Would you help us to be grateful for the gift you give us, and to offer that gift to the world? Amen.